Stretching over 1 million acres and including more than 1,000 interconnected lakes, the Minnesota Boundary Waters Canoe Area is a unique lakeland wilderness. It creates a habitat for hundreds of species of animals and plants, including roughly 400,000 acres of old-growth forests, with trees that date back to the 1600s.
It is the only lakeland wilderness in the National Wilderness Preservation System, at least of a significant size.
Native Americans inhabited the area long before Europeans arrived, and their pictographs can still be seen today on rocks exposed by ancient glaciers. Later, French voyagers traversed the area. Soon deposits of iron were discovered, and the vast supply of timber was tapped.
When a wilderness area happens in your backyard, you get very emotional about it. You take away a little bit, later they come and take back more, and before long they take it all.
The conflict over the Boundary Waters legislation in the 1970s still remains one of the most bitter, divided Minnesotan environmental controversies to date. People on each side had strong opinions concerning the wilderness, which included logging, mining, and motorized use. They were willing to fight for what they believed in, which didn't make the fight over the Boundary Waters legislation in Congress easy. As the 20th century rolled in, the issue of how the vast lakelands of northeastern Minnesota should be treated became much more of a contentious topic. There were plans to build roads through the area in the 20s, and there was a growing number of resorts deep inside the lakeland.
There were a few people who saw an opportunity to build resorts in the area where tourists could come and enjoy the canoeing or the boating.
There was rising tension between people who wanted to see the area preserved and mining and logging banned, and those who depended on it for their livelihood.
It all started when environmental groups zeroed in on the word wilderness and said the Boundary Waters Canoe Area was designated as such, and therefore all boats, motors, snowmobiles, timbermen, hunters, trappers, and miners ought to get out of it, and leave it to paddlers, campers, backpackers, skiers, snowshoers, and fishermen willing to angle from a canoe.
This controversy led up to the 1964 Wilderness Act. The act had special language on the boundary waters, which allowed logging to continue in parts of the wilderness and allowed motorboats to continue where they already were.
That created this kind of untenable situation because the Boundary Waters was a wilderness in name, but not necessarily in management.
Logging continued deeper than ever before into old-growth forests. A series of lawsuits about the Boundary Waters issues in the mid-70s intensified the debate and prompted politicians to start drafting bills that would resolve these issues for good.
The pro-wilderness side of us, we were often arguing the national interests. This area was federally owned land, owned by all people across the country, and its rarity in the modern world.
What was going through people's minds is that the people who applied all the political pressure were people from Chicago and New York and from Washington, D.C., and that's what made people mad. It was the local people had lost control of how their area was going to develop.
Jim Oberstar introduced the first major bill concerning the Boundary Waters in 1975. He was a congressman who represented northeastern Minnesota in the Boundary Waters area. His bill declassified around 400,000 acres of the Boundary Waters wilderness to a lower protective status, called a National Recreation Area.
That, of course, was vigorously opposed by the environmental community. It would have been a terrible precedent for all of the wildernesses across the country to have such a huge loss of designated wilderness.
Don Fraser, who represented the Minneapolis area in Congress, introduced a pure wilderness bill in 1976 that called for no logging, mining, motorboats, or snowmobiling. It was designed to combat the Oberstar bill. For the first couple of years, it was these two bills competing head-to-head. The residents of northeastern Minnesota, especially the Boundary Waters-based town of Ely, were mostly in support of the Oberstar bill.
There was a fight against establishing a wilderness area that precluded everyone up in northeastern Minnesota from enjoying the fishing and camping and recreation that was available in that area.
Although mining and logging were major issues in the debate,
the real polarizing emotional issue was the outboard motor, which the environmentalist wanted eliminated.
Most of Ely's 5,000 residents are staunchly in favor of keeping motorized boats and other powered vehicles in the nearby Boundary Waters canoe area.
Once it was clear that Fraser's pure wilderness bill was extremely unpopular with the residents in northeastern Minnesota and too ambitious for some Republicans in the House to vote for, Congressman Phil Burton from California and Bruce Vento from St. Paul introduced a new bill. The bill was mostly a wilderness bill. As a compromise, it added more motorboat lakes, taking into account the concerns of the northeastern Minnesota residents. The bill was brought to the House.
The House of Representatives voted in favor of a Boundary Waters canoe area.
It passed.
Then the problem was getting the bill passed through the Senate.
Getting the Burton-Vento bill through the Senate seemed increasingly difficult. The Senate had different politicians and the session was about to close. To add to that,
the subcommittee chair, Jim Abourezk of South Dakota, basically said, let's get the people who know this area best to negotiate a compromise on the motor issues. And so that occurred.
The compromise expanded the number of lakes that allowed motorboats and was called the Dayton Walls Compromise. It was the Dayton Walls bill that ultimately passed the Senate. After decades of uncertainty and conflict, on Saturday, October 21st, 1978, President Carter signed the BWCA bill that is still the law of the lakeland to this day. In the years that followed, there was turmoil over what this meant for northeastern Minnesota residents.
The Boundary Waters Act brought change. The government bought out resorts within the wilderness. It ended logging, phased out snowmobiling, and reduced motor access.
What has happened is that we got the Boundary Waters canoe area that is for lots of people, not necessarily people in the area, but lots of outsiders from around the world come to have this experience.
People who had traditionally made their living from motorized use of the wilderness now had to find a new way of doing things.
It was like chopping your arms off when it happened. You know, it just boom, you couldn't do that anymore. And you've been doing it, you know, for many years, and my father was doing it for all of his life. So you have to go out and find a new customer base.
A canoeist gliding through the BWCA might see moose, loons, bear, or beaver. What he won't see is clear cuts, mining trucks, roads, or resorts. All were here, all are gone. Tourists don't see the 60 years of environmental lobbying, the sometimes sneaky politics, or the painful cost of preservation.
The 1978 Act is still in effect to this day and has a far-reaching impact. It changed the economy of northeastern Minnesota, like the Boundary Waters-based town of Ely, that's now more of a canoeing and outfitting town.
In my view, the wilderness character of the Boundary Waters is much better than it was prior to 1978.
In environmental politics, victories are temporary and losses last forever. The long-rooted tension, balance, and compromise is still present today. The Boundary Waters controversy isn't over. Threats of mining in the Boundary Waters watershed are very real. Wilderness is a valuable resource that has the power to inspire and motivate. Wild places like the Boundary Waters are important to preserve for future generations, while taking into account the needs of the people directly affected by preservation.